the world has watched 365 days of tragedy. It started with an appalling and criminal attack on civilians. In response, more attacks against civilians and more crimes. For the past year, Gaza has been pounded. 75,000 pounds of explosives have been dropped from the sky. Entire neighbourhoods have been wiped from existence. Homes and businesses have become battlefields and then wastelands. Any red lines are far behind us, and normal is a distant memory. This week, we present a triptych on Gaza: health, justice, and future. My name is Hugo Goodridge, and you're listening to The New Arab Voice.
October 7th, 2023. Fighters from the Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam brigades of Hamas break out of Gaza and into Israel. 1,180 are killed in the attack, including 797 civilians. 251 civilians and soldiers are taken captive.
The Hamas-led attack on October 7th shook Israel, the region, and the world to its core. It was as unexpected as it was unprecedented. In the immediate aftermath, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu promised revenge. He told the nation, quote, "We will turn them into rubble." Over the next 12 months, he delivered on that promise. Month after month, bombs rained down on the coastal enclave. And from the start, it became very clear that nowhere would be safe.
November 18th, 2023. An Israeli airstrike hits Jabalia refugee camp, killing at least 80. The Palestinian death toll since the start of the war rises to 12,012.
The first panel of our triptych. A hospital is smashed. An injured man cannot be treated, and a child goes without food. Prior to the start of the war, Gaza was heavily reliant on aid for its survival. An average of 500 trucks entered a day. With the start of the war, the crossings closed and the aid quickly dried up. For a time, it was a much-discussed issue, but now has fallen away.
The lack of the aid conversation in the news is not due to some magical fix that somehow occurred in the last few months.
This is Dr. Yara Assi, Assistant Professor in Global Health Management and Informatics at the University of Central Florida, co-director of the Palestine Program for Health and Human Rights, and author of How War Kills, the Overlooked Threat to Our Health.
But I think simply media moving on from this issue to the many other issues in the region at this point, and also because the story has not changed. There's not much, unfortunately, news when it comes to the aid situation.
Over the past 12 months, there have been moments of focus, but the trend has been steadily downwards.
You know, we've heard in recent days that Israel has actually imposed new customs rules on aid. So food supplies have actually fallen again. Now, in the spring of 2024, this issue got a bit of global attention. The President of the United States spoke about it a bit. And so we did see a bit of a rise in aid coming in at that point. But once the Rafah border was seized in May, we saw a sharp dip in the amount of aid getting in, a dip in the amount of aid getting in from humanitarian agencies, and now more private trucks coming in, which are harder to track by humanitarian agencies.
In September, there were just 53 trucks of aid entering Gaza a day, 10% of the pre-war level.
Food supplies remain woefully inadequate. We're still seeing malnutrition, starvation, particularly concentrated in the areas of the north of the Gaza Strip, where Israel has continuously prevented aid from going, has denied aid convoys. Lack of fuel still exists, lack of medical supplies.
Today, at least 2.1 million people in Gaza are facing high levels of food insecurity. That's 96% of the population. 1 in 5 people in Gaza are facing starvation. The constant bombardments have also forced people from their homes, crowding them into tight, confined spaces with minimal, or more frequently, no access to clean water for drinking or hygiene purposes. Gaza has become a breeding ground for disease.
The polio outbreak, which fortunately was caught very quickly by Gaza's public health services, they found it in the wastewater in July and reported it immediately. This was, of course, the disease issue that caught global attention because, as we know, polio has been essentially eradicated in much of the world, including in the occupied Palestinian territories. There had not been a case in 30 years. And polio is highly contagious and, of course, can have lifelong consequences, especially for children who can either die or experience paralysis, as was reported by the first child, a 10-month-old, who reported having polio and experienced paralysis in his leg.
It was recognised that there was a risk that polio could spread and potentially infect Israeli soldiers, who then in turn could return to Israel and spread the disease further. In light of this, a rare window of humanity was opened and a mass vaccination program was launched. The window was short, though, and attacks soon resumed. The same consideration was not given to other diseases that are spreading across Gaza.
For months, we've seen reporting of high cases of other types of infectious disease. So in the winter, we saw high rates of respiratory infections, including the flu and COVID-19. Typically, these could be, in a functioning health system, these would be quite manageable, nothing to worry about. In a completely decimated health system with people in overcrowded shelters with no clean water, inadequate food, the pushing of people together who are being displaced multiple times, it is the perfect situation for infectious disease to spread.
Numerous, normally treatable diseases have been recorded in Gaza, but given the highly volatile situation on the ground, reporting and adequate tracking is not possible. It is generally accepted that the numbers that we have seen only represent a fraction of the true number of cases. The violence from the skies and on the ground is a daily waking nightmare for the people of Gaza. And while a cessation of hostilities does not look likely, it can happen. But infectious diseases do not respect the terms of a ceasefire.
It's kind of a genie's out of the bottle situation. You can't just immediately stop these diseases from spreading. And so we will continue to see the people of Gaza suffer after the bombs stop, simply because infectious disease does not care. You know, it's really a factor of living conditions and people's ability to get treatment, to live in safe conditions. And for the foreseeable future, no one in Gaza will have livable conditions, access to all the medical equipment needed. And so this will continue to be a problem, I think, for months, if not years.
December 7th, 2023. Palestinians gather outside an UNRWA center in Deir el-Balah, hoping for aid. The doors do not open. There is no aid. The death toll rises to 17,177.
Dying from disease or starvation during a time of war is what is known as indirect mortality. That is to say, deaths caused by war which are not the result of bombs, missiles, or bullets.
So we've seen as early spring, stillbirth rates increase by 300%. Maternal mortality has increased significantly.
As mentioned, starving to death is an immediate threat for people in Gaza, and conditions like malnutrition are equally dangerous.
They affect the body for life, especially in children. So children who at this point have not eaten well or nutritiously for more than a year may have stunted growth for the rest of their lives, and that has significant health risks that will follow them through adulthood. So they may have cognitive impairment. Women who have stunted growth have a greater rate of maternal or infant mortality when they become mothers later on. So this has a very long tail.
The threat from indirect mortality is growing by the day.
Indirect mortality is a significant problem. We don't even have the tools to fully grasp the extent of what has happened and the potential of what can happen to this population of 2.2 million. And it's very distressing to consider that people who have lived, who have dodged bombs, who have been displaced 8, 9 times, can still die from starvation or from an illness that is otherwise completely preventable or at the least treatable, but not for these people. There is simply no infrastructure, unfortunately, to prevent the worst of what may happen.
The risk of indirect mortality could be significantly reduced with access to reliable healthcare and healthcare facilities.
I think the last numbers from the World Health Organization was less than half of Gaza's hospitals are even partially functioning. So this means, maybe they have one wing of the hospital where they're able to treat just trauma patients. So if you have cancer, if you have heart disease, if you have dementia, if you break a leg doing something, any of the other typical health risks that anybody has, there is almost no infrastructure for you.
With the current situation, it's difficult to see a future for healthcare in Gaza. How will they rebuild?
What will the import process look like? So Gaza has been under blockade since 2007. It's been bombed multiple times since then, prior to October 7th, and it's never fully rebuilt after any of these assaults, simply because of the extremely strict import restrictions Israel places even on medical equipment, and in some cases, especially on medical equipment. So very difficult to get cancer treatment and diagnosis materials into Gaza, or PET scanners, CT scanners, these kinds of really important equipment. Aside from that, Israel also has restrictions on things like cement and pipes and wires and all of this kind of building blocks of any type of building. So if Israel is permitted to maintain these strict restrictions on what is able to enter, who knows how and if this health system can be rebuilt in terms of infrastructure, of course.
When the bombing stops, securing the materials needed to rebuild a healthcare system that has enough provisions to provide even a basic level of care to the population will be a huge mountain to climb. But even the best equipped hospital in the world cannot function without the properly trained staff.
Right? We need doctors, we need nurses, we need midwives, we need pharmacists, we need lab technicians, we need medical assistants. The list goes on and on. Current reporting shows hundreds of health workers have been killed in airstrikes. Hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands more have been displaced, and so they're unable to work. Some of those killed have been specialists who had to train outside of Gaza in their specialties because they're unable to study for those specialties in Gaza due to, again, restrictions. That is human capital that cannot just be rebuilt like a building. This will take generations of refiltering people through the health system or the education system. I know many medical students who had been studying in Gaza on October 7th. Some are displaced and their studies have been completely interrupted, while others who have managed to get out are continuing their studies in Egypt, in the Gulf, in Europe, in the US, wherever they can get placement. Will they return? Can they return? If not, that is essentially an entire generation of health workers that are vitally needed that will not return to Gaza.
January 29th, 2024. A car carrying 6-year-old Hind Rajab and 6 of her family members is hit by an Israeli tank shell and later by machine gun fire. 2 rescue workers are shot dead by the Israeli army as they attempted to retrieve Hind from her family's car. The death toll rises to 26,637.
If the hospitals can be rebuilt, and if doctors, nurses and surgeons can be found to staff the facilities, and that's a big if, then wounds can be healed. Treatments can be provided. Diseases can be cured. But after 12 months, the scars of this war run well below the skin.
There is no one with, functional mental health at this moment. Essentially, everyone is displaced, which is a significant mental stressor. Almost everyone has witnessed or experienced loved ones, neighbors, teachers dying or going missing. We've seen, of course, countless videos of children that have been the last surviving member of their family, children with life-altering injuries, including amputations, parents who have lost their children, in some cases lost multiple children. No one is working, no one is in school, no one is living in conditions that are adequate to sustain life. And again, bombs continuously dropping around you. We don't have the words, the tools to understand this level of mental trauma.
We have seen some efforts to try and ease the mental strain on the residents of Gaza, particularly children. Simple things like drawing or a puppet show. An attempt at calm. Trying to create a brief window of joy.
There's only so much they can do, and there's only so much that these kinds of efforts can actually, change in someone's mind when the conditions that you're living in are so desperate. When fear of losing your life is not abstract, it is a daily, not even daily, minute by minute consideration. There is no sense of safety, no sense of security now for more than a year. Anyone who has survived to this point has experienced loss, has experienced trauma. And then there's the vital factor of what's next for me? What's going to happen to me? My home is destroyed. Perhaps I've lost loved ones. My university has been destroyed. I don't have a job. For those without, citizenship elsewhere, they're essentially stateless. They don't know where they can go.
February 29th, 2024. More than 100 Palestinians are killed and 750 are wounded when Israeli forces open fire on people waiting for food in Gaza City. It becomes known as the Flower Massacre. The death toll rises to 30,035.
There's kind of this discussion that those who are surviving are the lucky ones. But I bet if you asked many of them, they would not consider themselves as such. And in fact, I've seen several studies and reporting who have talked to people in Gaza who said, frankly, I wish I had died because I don't know what I'm living for. I'm alone and I have nothing and I have no future. And everyone I love is gone. Or, I have lost my limbs. I have lost my livelihood. Parents who have lost their children and children who have lost their parents, there's no therapy for getting past that. That is a struggle that you will live through forever. And so this will be a generation, multiple generations in Gaza who have experienced unfathomable pain and loss, and many of whom have no way out of that. It's really distressing to consider. And I think when we have some time and space to look back, which we don't currently have at the moment while bombs are dropping, this will be one of the takeaways from this time, is what has been done to, and not just the people in Gaza, to the Palestinian people.
The second panel of our triptych. A courthouse. It's vast in size, authoritative, but also slowly shrinking. Outside, hopeful witnesses queue.
March 18th, 2024. Israeli forces stormed the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza City. Gaza's Ministry of Health say that 30,000 people, including displaced civilians, wounded patients, and medical staff, are trapped inside the complex. 80 people are arrested, including medical workers and journalists. The death toll rises to 31,726.
The Hamas-led attack of October 7th has been described as a war crime and a crime against humanity. Similarly, Israel's leadership has been accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity, including genocide. All this prompted the International Criminal Court in The Hague to apply for arrest warrants on May 20th. The application named Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, as well as Hamas leaders Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Deif. A warrant was also issued for Ismail Haniyeh, but he was assassinated in July this year.
My office charges Netanyahu and Gallant as co-perpetrators and as superiors in the commission of these alleged crimes. Israel, like all states, has the right to defend its population. It has every right to ensure the return of hostages that have been criminally and callously taken. Those rights, however, do not absolve Israel of its obligations to comply with international humanitarian law.
The process for international justice has begun. It's in the very early stages. But following the past 12 months, the hunger for justice is incredibly high.
So the immediate next step after applications for arrest warrants are granted by the pretrial chamber, which is reviewing them, would be that the pretrial chamber would then order the registry of the ICC to prepare a request for cooperation to seek arrest and surrender of those individuals for which those arrest warrants have been granted.
This is Ide Dijkstal, barrister at 33 Bedford Road Chambers, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Strategic Litigation Project, and instructed as counsel for the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians in London.
So what this means is that the registry of the court would put together a letter to all state parties who have signed on to the Rome Statute and therefore agreed to the obligations and the duties that come with being a member state to the ICC, and would send that letter to all of those state parties, informing them about the pretrial chamber's decision to grant applications for arrest warrants and that there's an outstanding arrest warrant against certain individuals at that point. And then with it would be a request for that state to arrest and surrender to the court that individual if they were to ever come onto the territory of the state party.
The ICC was born out of an ideal: justice for the most heinous of crimes. But that does not mean that the court is all-powerful and has the ability to dictate to nations.
The ICC is going to have the powers that carries with it being a treaty-based organization. So I think it's important to understand that the International Criminal Court was formed, it's what's called a treaty-based organization, because state parties decide to come together and sign the Rome Statute, and it's based on that mutual agreement to sign on to the Rome Statute and to voluntarily accept the obligations that come with it, that the court is formed. And that's what gives the court the power to carry out the proceedings, issue arrest warrants, and then also to make requests for cooperation and requests that states carry out those duties to those particular states that have signed on.
Nations volunteer to sign up to the Rome Statute and are obliged to enforce the court's rulings. For example, arrest warrants.
If a state party was to fail to do that, so let's say that one of those individuals was to come onto the territory of the state party and that person was not arrested, then there are some steps that the court can take in order to raise the fact that that state has failed its obligations.
This has happened in the past.
In 2015, the former president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, traveled to South Africa. And at that time, there'd been a long standing arrest warrant that was outstanding at the court. And therefore, South Africa, as a state party to the Rome Statute, would have been alerted to the arrest warrant and requested to carry out these obligations that we're discussing just now, but they didn't do that. And al-Bashir traveled to South Africa and then was allowed to leave as well. And there was no arrest. And that was brought before the ICC in a discussion about what that state party's obligations and duties are, especially when it's a head of state, an acting head of state who travels to the territory.
There are legal principles regarding heads of state and certain immunities that are granted to them.
So there was a discussion then at the court, and there was litigation about whether this request and the obligations on state parties applies when it pertains to an acting head of state. And I think what's important to note here is that the ICC made a very important decision on this, saying that head of state immunity under customary international law does not apply in regards to the execution of an ICC arrest warrant. So those obligations of state parties to carry out those requests for arrest and surrender also apply when there's individuals who are acting heads of state.
In the case of non-compliance, the ICC has the option to refer that nation state to the UN for further action. In the case of South Africa and the warrant against Omar al-Bashir, the court ultimately chose not to refer the case.
April 1st, 2024. 7 aid workers from World Central Kitchen, including British, Polish, Australian, and Irish nationals, are killed in an Israeli airstrike. World Central Kitchen and 2 other aid agencies suspend operations. The death toll rises to 32,845.
The number of victims from the ongoing war in Gaza grows bigger by the day, by the hour. It is moral and just that those who have perpetrated crimes be held accountable for them.
I think it's a well-known fact that at the ICC, the wheels of justice take a long time, and that from the moment that arrest warrants are issued until you get to a point where the person is before the court and the trial has concluded, and then appeals and finalization of those proceedings, it can be many, many years. And other cases before the court have even gone into being over a decade.
But even by the standards of the ICC, things are moving slowly.
We can look back on what's been done in the past. And what we're seeing now is that it's, we're about over 4 months now in to those applications being before the pretrial chamber with no decision made. And in previous cases before the court, we've seen that the chamber has acted with much more expediency, and including in complex and high-level arrest warrants having to do with head of states. So looking at the arrest warrants regarding Russia, for the time from when the application was submitted until the arrest warrants were granted was about a month. And there was about the same timeline for the arrest warrants that were issued against Gaddafi in Libya and Gbagbo in the Ivory Coast as well, both heads of state. So we are now past that point of how long it's usually taken the court to issue a decision on the applications for arrest warrants.
Even if arrest warrants are approved, the court would then still have to make a final decision about whether a conviction is likely and whether or not to proceed to trial. And then if the leaders of Hamas and Israel can be brought into a courtroom, there will still be a lengthy trial, followed by an appeals process.
And finally, if, once it's past the appeal proceedings, then there is also a phase at the ICC for reparations as well. So if there is a conviction of that person, then victims before the court have the chance to make submissions about what kinds of reparations would best help them recover from the harm that they've suffered as a result of those crimes that the person was convicted of. So you can see that all of those stages together lead to a very long timeline at the ICC, but all very, very important stages to move through.
For those watching carefully, and even those not watching too carefully, a tidal wave of photos and videos have filled our television screens and social media feeds. While we don't have precise details about the evidence that has been submitted to the ICC, we have been given some indication about its form.
What the prosecution has said publicly is the type of evidence that has submitted there's a wide scope of evidence. They've said that there's, firsthand testimonies from survivors, from victims of the crimes, from some of the hostages as well, and also eyewitnesses to the crimes, on both sides. There's authenticated video evidence, photo evidence, audio evidence. They've used satellite imagery, and then also have looked at statements, which I think is also quite important as well. So statements made either by the perpetrators or those associated with the perpetrators in order to look at that evidence of intent, whether there was a common plan, whether there was state policy, those kinds of aspects.
May 11th, 2024. The Israeli army orders over 700,000 people to leave eastern and central Rafah. The death toll rises to 34,971.
With the news that the arrest warrants had been applied for by the ICC, Israel and some of its allies went on the attack.
The outrageous decision by the ICC prosecutor, Karim Khan, to seek arrest warrants against the democratically elected leaders of Israel is a moral outrage of historic proportions. It will cast an everlasting mark of shame on the International Court.
And it should be made clear that no state, whether they're a state party to the Rome Statute or not, can interfere or prevent a prosecution at the ICC. So no matter what kind of interference or what attempts are made through these kinds of tactics, the court, including the Office of the Prosecutor and also the judges in chambers, must remain independent and free of influence. And this court is meant to be an independent court, free of that kind of influence.
For those that have suffered over the past 12 months, are suffering today, and will suffer in the future, it can be frustrating to watch the wheels of justice turn so slowly, intensely frustrating. But however slowly justice is happening, the message is going out.
It made very clear, the prosecutor made very clear that by issuing those applications, it was meant to underline that international law and the laws of armed conflict apply to everyone, and that no one can act with impunity, no matter their rank, whether they're foot soldier, commander, leader, civilian leader of a country. So nobody is above the law. And so I would hope that that deterrent effect that the ICC is meant to have is continuing, whether with this conflict or with any other conflict or any other leaders around the world. But I think that there is some understandable questions that people are asking about whether or not in this particular conflict, the ICC is having a deterrent effect. And I think that's why it's so important that state parties, the international community, and even states that are not members of the Rome Statute fully support the court and make sure that it isn't coming under any of this pressure, and support the court moving forward as quickly as possible, and that the rule of law and the independence of the court is supported as well, in order to make sure that it can move forward with doing its work, and that this concept that international law applies to everyone is fully respected.
June 21st, 2024. Shelling near a Red Cross office, which was surrounded by refugee tents, kills at least 22. The death toll rises to 37,551.
The final panel of our triptych. A city lies in ruins. The ground is uneven and shaky, littered with the rubble of a previous existence. Hiding under the surface, fresh and different dangers. It's difficult to imagine a future for Gaza. Where can it go from here? Particularly as bombs continue to rain down with brutal abandon and prospects for an end look slim. But there will be a day after in Gaza. One day. The world has seen the mistakes of not planning for a day after, and with all that Gaza and its population has suffered, mistakes are not something that can be afforded.
For the United States, it's clear, there's going to be there is a conflict, and it's going to end at some point, and people have to think about what comes next.
This is Nathan Brown, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University and non-resident Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
I'm not sure that's how the Israeli leadership sees it. It doesn't see this as a conflict that will have a clear and clean ending, and one which will be followed by a diplomatic rather than a military path. For them, this is an ongoing conflict that they're just cursed with. And I think for some of the other actors as well, for instance, Hamas, this is a long-term struggle against Israel. They may want some kind of short to medium-term understanding, but they're not necessarily looking for any kind of political reconstruction that will resolve all issues immediately afterwards.
There are multiple parties to this conflict, and each side has a different view of the day after.
For the Israelis, I think the concern that they put it is simply security. Israelis are very deeply divided among themselves as to security of what. Is it security of individual Israeli lives? Is it security of Israel within the 1967 borders? Is it security of Israel within the entire land of Israel? That would include the West Bank and Gaza. Israelis are deeply divided, and the current government sort of tends towards that last camp that sees the entire land of Israel as an area that they need to be concerned about in security terms.
This mindset is really a continuation of a mindset that has been pervasive within a growing part of the current Israeli leadership.
Palestinians, I think, are in a different place. It's almost, I think, for many Palestinians, security of their own lives. I mean, the damage, dislocation in Gaza is absolutely horrific. In the West Bank, there's concern that what's happening in the West Bank now is what has happened over the past year in Gaza, just on very slow speed and with less intensity. So I think it's just ability to resume normal life that I think is big for Palestinians.
If the current ambitions of Palestinians extend to a sense of normalcy and not complete liberation or freedom, it should give you an idea of how bad things have become. For the US and other Western powers, yes, also security. Certainly complete security for the Israelis and also for the Palestinians, but probably a different form of security. Also, a desire not to see the mistakes of the past be made again.
There was a sense from the beginning that this looked to Americans a little bit like Iraq, their own experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan. And there would be two phases of the conflict, a military phase and then a political phase. And so they're anxious to move on to a political phase, which addresses some of the underlying conditions that produced the war over the past year. So they're looking for some kind of arrangement that would allow for people in Gaza to rebuild their lives, rebuild their homes, and then some kind of diplomatic and political process that will begin to address the outstanding issues between Israelis and Palestinians. And I think most international actors, the Europeans, the UN, and so on, basically kind of line up behind the United States in different ways, but they fundamentally see those as challenges.
It's a nice idea, but there's a fundamental problem. Israel does not appear to be listening to the US. It hasn't been listening for a while. And any mechanisms that the US could use to rein Israel in have not and are not being deployed.
Well, that's absolutely the problem. So over the past year, the Biden administration has consistently said that what they want is some kind of outcome that makes it possible to resume some sort of Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and that ultimately leads to a two-state solution. And the Israeli government has become stronger and stronger in pushing against that. A few months ago, the Knesset actually passed a resolution saying a Palestinian state alongside an Israeli state would be an existential threat to the state of Israel. So they're just going in a very different direction. The Biden administration, I would say, pushed hard rhetorically, but never put any muscle behind it. And now it's clear that effort has just come to an end. There's an American election in a month, and it'll be up to the incoming administration how to pick that up.
EU nations can certainly kick up a fuss when it comes to Israeli ideas and its plans for Gaza and the wider Palestinian territories. But it is really the US who should be able to make Israel listen. And they're not. They haven't for months.
July 8th, 2024. A 6-year-old child died of starvation, dehydration, and a lack of medical supplies at Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital. The death toll rises to 38,243.
It's not known when the fighting in Gaza will end, but when it does, little will be left standing. So far, the war has created an estimated 45,000 tons of concrete and metal debris. Mixed in with that debris and hidden from sight, deadly unexploded ordnance. It is thought that it would take 15 years to clear the rubble. According to the UN, 63% of Gaza's buildings have been destroyed or damaged. 70% of schools have been destroyed or damaged. 227,591 housing units have been destroyed or damaged. 86% of the road network has been destroyed or damaged. In April, a joint report by the World Bank and the United Nations estimated the cost of the damage to be $18.5 billion. There has been a further 5 months of fighting and attacks since the release of that report.
I think there are a couple problems, and actually money isn't the biggest one. The biggest one is probably just the political framework. If we are right now, today, if this is the day after, then any relief efforts will have to be undertaken in a condition of ongoing military operation. They may be lower scale, they may be episodic, but we're not going to see some kind of overarching political authority and settlement in which everybody says, okay, the fighting stopped, now let's rebuild houses.
The cost of rebuilding will be huge, vast. But the money exists. The money always exists. There has to be the impetus to spend the money. Even if low-level violence continues, rebuilding efforts will be unlikely to happen. Who wants to start construction in that sort of environment? Who wants to spend months building homes and offices if they are to be destroyed in a matter of seconds the next month?
And then you've got a secondary problem that even if international organizations, non-governmental or multinational, go in under those conditions, who is going to be able to do it? One of the biggest problems here is that the most experienced and extensive organization, UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, is one that the Israelis are treating essentially as, for a long time they treated it as a necessary nuisance. Now it's an unnecessary nuisance. And so some of the most experienced international aid actors, especially the multinational ones attached to the United Nations in some way, shape, or form, are going to find it very, very difficult to operate and would really need very strong political muscle from the United States, from the Europeans, in order even just to continue in existence.
Prior to the war, Gaza had experienced a 17-year-long siege. During the siege, Israel imposed strict restrictions on what could and could not enter Gaza. The list of what could not enter was exhaustive and included basic construction materials.
At this point, I think for the short to medium term, Israel will certainly have a veto over any kind of arrangements of people who want to bring things in or be active or undertake reconstruction. Israel can just effectively stop it. But I think they're going to have an intensive presence on the ground for this foreseeable future as well.
August 29th, 2024. An Israeli airstrike on an apartment building kills 9 members of the Al-Tawil family, including 5 infants and 2 women, one of whom was pregnant. The death toll rises to 40,602.
When a day after does come, someone is going to have to take control of the day-to-day running of Gaza. Some have suggested that the Palestinian Authority, who oversee the West Bank, could be a viable solution, But given the erosion that the PA has been subjected to by Israeli policies and the general lack of trust that the Palestinian people have in the PA's current leadership, it doesn't seem like a likely candidate. There is support among Palestinians for some sort of unity government with the PA and Hamas. A September poll by the Institute for Social and Economic Progress asked Palestinians, if there was a transition period after the war, who would you want to rule the Gaza Strip? 46% of respondents supported a unity government. Palestinians should govern Palestinian affairs. But in the face of an extended Israeli occupation, the path to self-governance looks incredibly fraught. Another option? An international transitional authority, like the UN.
If you want a UN body to oversee, for instance, education, well, you have that already with UNRWA, but for them to be operating in an environment in which the Israelis are still in security control, I don't see that as viable. The current Israeli leadership makes clear that they, after what has happened, they see only Israel as responsible for its own security in Gaza. And therefore, I think they'd be willing to cooperate with some sort of international effort that led humanitarian relief, that picked up the trash, and so on. But they're not willing to basically say we're withdrawing from Gaza and we're not going back. They're not willing to say that. And absent that, I just don't see any political framework that would allow a real full governing authority, not just service provision where it's possible, but a real governing authority to emerge. I just don't see that happening.
September 13th, 2024. The Director General of Primary Healthcare at Gaza's Health Ministry, Musa Abed, says that 74% of life-saving medicines are not available, and more than 85% of specialized medicines for cancer treatment and kidney dialysis are unavailable in Gaza. The death toll rises to 41,182.
The past 12 months have been a catastrophe for humanity. I'm not sure how else to describe it. What we've seen, what's happened, what people are doing to their fellow humans, this will stain humanity for generations to come. And after all of this, it's tragic to say, we could be here again in 12 months' time, still wondering how it could possibly get worse, still wondering where we go from here, still counting the dead.
October 7th, 2024. An Israeli airstrike hits the Jabalia refugee camp, killing 8. The official death toll rises to 41,870. 16,756 are children, and 11,346 are women.
This episode of The New Arab Voice was written and produced by me, Hugo Goodridge, with additional help from Oliver Mitzi. Our theme music was by Omar Al-Phil. The New Arab Voice will be back shortly with a new episode. Until then, you can find all our previous episodes on all major podcast platforms. You can check out our Instagram page and X account, both at TNA Podcasts, for additional content. And you can email us, podcast@newarab.com. You can subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. You can also rate and review, which helps us spread the word. Don't forget to follow The New Arab on Facebook, X, and Instagram for all the latest news, analysis, and opinion from the region